There is a moment that almost every person in a position of leadership has experienced at least once. You are standing in front of a room full of people. You have spent weeks preparing. You know every detail of what needs to be said. You have the data, the strategy, the vision. And yet, as you begin to speak, you watch faces go blank, eyes drift to phones. A few people nod politely, but the energy in the room tells a different story. Something is not landing. Something is being lost in the translation between what you know and what they are hearing. Or perhaps the moment looks different for you. Maybe it is in a one-on-one conversation with someone you are trying to lead. And no matter how many times you explain your expectations, the message does not seem to get through. Or perhaps you are in a meeting where someone else stands up and speaks with a kind of quiet authority that draws every single person in the room toward them. And you find yourself wondering what it is exactly that they are doing differently. Because they are not necessarily smarter than you. They do not necessarily have more experience, but they have something, a way of speaking, a way of holding themselves, a way of choosing their words, that makes people listen. That something has a name. It is called leadership communication, and it is one of the most misunderstood skills in the entire landscape of human development. Most people, when they think about communication, think about talking. They think about the volume of words, the speed of their delivery, the impressiveness of their vocabulary. They equate being articulate with being effective. They believe that if they can simply say more things, or say them more forcefully, or demonstrate how much they know, then people will follow them. But this is one of the most persistent and costly myths in leadership. Great leaders are rarely remembered for talking the most. They are remembered for communicating the most clearly. Think about the leaders, in any field, in any era, who have moved people to action, to belief, to transformation. What they share is not a gift for verbal excess. What they share is the ability to take something complex and make it simple, something uncertain and make it clear, something fearful and make it steady. They do not overwhelm their audience with information. They give their audience something to hold on to, a direction, a purpose, a reason. A brilliant idea has very little value if it cannot be communicated effectively. This is a truth that the world's most successful organizations understand intuitively, but that individual leaders often learn only after years of frustration. You can have the right strategy and watch it fail because no one understood it. You can have the right vision and see it dissolve because you could not inspire belief in others. You can be the most competent person in every room and still lose influence, lose trust, lose the confidence of the people you are trying to lead, simply because the gap between what you think and what you say is too wide. This audiobook exists because that gap can be closed. Leadership communication is not a magical gift that some people are born with. It is a discipline. It is a set of skills, habits, and mindsets that can be studied, practiced, and developed. And when those skills are genuinely developed, not just performed, not just imitated, but internalized, they can change the way people experience you as a leader. They can change the way your ideas travel through an organization. They can change the quality of your relationships, the depth of trust you build, and the size of the impact you are able to create. Throughout this experience, we are going to explore what leadership communication really means. We are going to go beneath the surface techniques and look at the psychology of why certain messages land and others do not. We are going to talk about how clarity is built, how trust is earned through words and consistency, how to listen in ways that most leaders never fully learn, and how to hold yourself under pressure in a way that makes others feel safe to follow you. We are going to look at storytelling, not as a manipulation tactic, but as the most human and powerful way that meaning has ever been transferred from one mind to another. We are going to explore the nonverbal dimensions of communication, the presence, the posture, the pace, that shape how people receive everything you say before you have finished saying it. And we are going to sit with some honest truths about the communication habits that quietly undermine influence, credibility, and trust. But perhaps most importantly, we are going to explore a fundamental shift in perspective, because the greatest transformation in any leader's communication journey is not a technique. It is a reorientation. It is moving from a focus on speaking to a focus on serving. Moving from wanting to be heard to wanting to create understanding. Moving from performing competence to actually connecting with people. Leadership begins with communication, not because leaders always have the right answers, but because the right answers, locked in one person's head, cannot move the world. Communication is the mechanism by which ideas become shared reality. It is the infrastructure of trust, of alignment, of collective action. And it is, therefore, one of the most important things a leader can commit to developing. Not once, not in a single training session, but continuously, deliberately, over the course of an entire career. So let us begin, not with a list of tips, not with a collection of techniques to memorize before your next presentation. Let us begin with a deeper understanding of what happens in the space between a leader who speaks and a person who listens. Because everything else, every skill, every strategy, every habit we will explore, is built on what happens in that space. Every message you have ever sent has passed through a filter before it reached its destination. And that filter is not in your words. It is in the mind of the person receiving them. This is the foundational insight of the psychology of influence, and it is one that many leaders spend entire careers failing to truly appreciate. We tend to think about communication from the sender's perspective. We craft what we want to say. We think about how we want to say it. We consider the logic of our argument or the strength of our data, and then we transmit our message and assume, on some level, that if the words were right, the outcome should follow. But the person on the other end is not a blank receiver. They are a complex, layered human being who is simultaneously evaluating your message, filtering it through their past experiences, assessing your credibility, reading your body language, and deciding, often in the first few seconds, whether they trust you enough to be open to what you are saying. Trust is the first currency of all communication, before logic, before evidence, before even clarity. If a person does not trust you, the quality of your argument is almost irrelevant. They will find reasons to dismiss it. They will hear your words through the distorting lens of suspicion or indifference. And your message, no matter how carefully constructed, will not land the way you intended. This is why the very first thing a communicator must think about is not what to say, but who they are in the eyes of the person they are speaking to. Trust is not built in a single conversation. It is built across interactions over time, through the accumulation of small moments where your words and your actions proved consistent with each other. When you said you would do something, and then you did it. when you were honest even when it was uncomfortable, when you listened when it would have been easier to dismiss, when you gave credit where it was due and took responsibility when it was not. Trust is the compound interest of consistent integrity, and it is what makes your communication land with weight and credibility, instead of sliding off the surface. But within any single conversation, there is also a moment of trust or distrust that happens very quickly. Researchers who study first impressions have consistently found that people form initial assessments of credibility, warmth, and competence within seconds of encountering someone for the first time. This does not mean those first impressions are always accurate or permanent, but it does mean that as a communicator, you cannot afford to treat the opening of any interaction as throwaway time. The tone you set at the beginning of a conversation shapes how everything that follows is interpreted, and that tone is communicated not only through your words, but through your pace, your eye contact, your posture, and your apparent level of calm. Credibility is the second pillar. And credibility is fascinating because it is not simply a function of how much you know. Many highly credible communicators are not the most technically informed people in the room. What they have is a quality of confidence without arrogance. The sense that they are grounded in what they know, honest about what they do not know, and clear about the difference. People trust communicators who do not oversell, who do not claim certainty where none exists, who are willing to say, "I do not know, but here is how we will find out," without losing their footing. That kind of honesty, paradoxically, builds far more credibility than a confident claim that later turns out to be wrong. There is also a dimension of credibility that is often overlooked, which is the credibility of care. People believe communicators who they sense are genuinely invested in their well-being, their understanding, and their success. This is not the same as people pleasing or softening hard truths to avoid discomfort. The most credible leaders can deliver difficult messages, feedback, bad news, hard decisions, without losing the person's trust. What makes this possible is not the softness of the message, but the clarity of the relationship. When someone knows you are genuinely on their side, they can receive hard truths from you that they could not receive from someone they experienced as indifferent or adversarial. Emotional connection is the third pillar, and it is where many technically minded leaders struggle most. Emotion is not the opposite of reason. It is not a compromise of logic or a sign of weakness. Emotion is the fuel by which information is converted into meaning. Human beings do not take action on data alone. We take action based on how data makes us feel, what it means to us, what it connects to in our deeper sense of identity and purpose. When a leader communicates purely at the level of logic, presenting facts, figures, and frameworks without any emotional resonance, the information might be understood intellectually, but it rarely moves people. It sits in the mind without igniting anything. The leaders who create genuine movement, who shift not just the knowledge, but the behavior of the people around them, understand that emotion is not a distraction from their message. Emotion is the vehicle of their message. When you help someone feel the significance of what you are communicating, not just understand it, you have reached a fundamentally different level of influence. And this is not about manipulation. Authentic emotional resonance is built on honesty, not on manufacturing feelings that are not real. It is about allowing what genuinely matters to come through in your communication, rather than scrubbing your language of everything human in pursuit of professional neutrality. Clarity is the fourth pillar, and in many ways the most immediately actionable. Clarity is not simply about using simple words. Clarity is about having a precise understanding of what you want to communicate, and then finding the most direct path between your meaning and your listener's comprehension. This is harder than it sounds, because our thoughts rarely arrive pre-organized. We understand something in a complex, associative, multidimensional way, and the challenge of communication is to take that complexity and render it in a form that another person's mind can receive and process without confusion. The enemy of clarity is not complexity. Some ideas are genuinely complex, and the honest communication of a complex idea is more valuable than a false simplification that misleads. The enemy of clarity is vagueness, the habit of speaking in abstractions, in jargon, in language that circles around a meaning without landing on it. Vague communication is often not a sign of deep thinking. It is often a sign of unclear thinking, or of thinking that has not been translated yet from the private experience of the communicator to the public experience of the listener. Great communicators do the translation work. They do the labor of asking themselves, what exactly am I trying to say? And then they say that thing as directly and precisely as possible. The psychology of influence also includes what researchers call cognitive load, the amount of mental effort required for a person to process a message. When you make someone work too hard to understand you, when your sentences are too long, your structure too convoluted, your vocabulary too technical, you are consuming their cognitive bandwidth. And the more bandwidth your message requires just to be decoded, the less is available for actual engagement with its substance. Skilled communicators manage cognitive load deliberately. They break complex ideas into digestible pieces. They signal structure clearly so listeners always know where they are in the conversation. They pace themselves to allow comprehension before moving forward. They do not perform their intelligence through complexity. They express their intelligence through clarity. There is one more psychological principle worth naming before we move forward, because it underpins everything else in this conversation about influence. It is the principle of reciprocity of respect. People are profoundly attuned to whether they are being treated as intelligent, capable, worthy individuals, or as problems to be managed, audiences to be impressed, or subjects to be manipulated. When someone feels genuinely respected in a conversation, their defensive walls come down. Their natural resistance to being influenced softens. They become genuinely open. And that openness is the soil in which real communication can take root. The communicators who command the greatest long-term influence are not those who have mastered the slickest techniques. They are the ones who have cultivated a deep, genuine respect for the people they communicate with, who walk into every conversation carrying the belief that the other person is worth being fully present for. That belief shows in everything, in how carefully they listen, in how precisely they choose their words, in how honestly they navigate disagreement. And it creates a quality of communication that no technique, however sophisticated, can replicate. There is a particular kind of intelligence that shows itself not in complexity, but in the ability to make complexity disappear. We live in an era of extraordinary informational density. Leaders in every field are expected to process enormous amounts of information, synthesize competing priorities, navigate ambiguity, and then communicate their conclusions to people who have neither the time, the context, nor the patience to consume everything the leader has consumed. The ability to distill, to take a mountain of input and communicate its essential meaning without losing its integrity, is perhaps the most practically valuable communication skill a leader can develop. But clarity is not just a compression skill. It is, at its most fundamental level, a thinking skill. You cannot communicate clearly what you have not yet clearly thought. This is a truth that is both obvious and deeply uncomfortable, because it means that when our communication is unclear, the problem is usually not in the words we chose. It is in the thinking those words were trying to represent. The discipline of clear communication, therefore, begins with the discipline of clear thinking, the willingness to sit with an idea until it becomes precise, until its edges are defined, until you can state it in a single sentence that a thoughtful person would immediately understand. This is not easy. Most of our thinking happens in a kind of internal shorthand, a rapid, associative, often elliptical process that makes sense to us, because we have all the context and all the prior knowledge. The problem arises when we transmit that shorthand to someone else who does not share our context. We are essentially giving them an abbreviated map and expecting them to navigate a territory they have never visited. Real clarity requires us to do something uncomfortable. It requires us to temporarily forget what we know and approach our own ideas as an outsider would. To ask ourselves, if I came to this message with no prior knowledge, would I understand it? Would I know what to do with it? Would I know why it matters? One of the most powerful disciplines any communicator can adopt is the practice of the single clear sentence. Before preparing any communication, whether it is a presentation, a difficult conversation, a strategic memo, or even a brief email, ask yourself, what is the one thing I most need the other person to understand or believe or do as a result of this communication? Not the 3 things, not the 7 things, the one thing. Because if you cannot reduce your intended message to a single clear sentence, the odds that your audience will be able to do it for you are very low. But if you can, then everything else in your communication can be organized around that central point with a clarity and purposefulness that audiences feel even when they cannot articulate why. This principle of purposeful communication, the idea that every message should have a clear and conscious intent, sounds simple but represents a significant departure from how most people actually communicate. Most communication is reactive rather than intentional. We speak in response to what has just been said. We fill silences because silence feels uncomfortable. We elaborate because elaboration makes us feel more thorough, more credible, more complete. We use more words than necessary because it feels safer, more professional, more substantial. But all of this reactive elaboration serves the communicator's anxiety more than it serves the listener's comprehension. Intentional communication asks a different question before speaking. Not, what do I want to say? But, what does this person need to hear? And what is the most effective way to deliver it? This is not the same as telling people what they want to hear. Intentional communication can be uncomfortable. It can deliver hard truths. It can push back on popular thinking. But it does all of this with a clarity of purpose that respects the listener's intelligence and time. It does not meander. It does not perform. It does not pad. It arrives where it means to arrive and then stops. There is an art to knowing when to stop that many leaders underestimate. Communication is a real problem, not just an inconvenience. When leaders speak too long, They dilute the impact of every point they make. The attention of even the most engaged audience is a finite resource. Every word you use is a small withdrawal from that resource. And the communicators who understand this, who have developed a genuine discipline around economy of expression, make each word count in a way that those who over-explain simply cannot. There is a reason that great speeches, great pitches, great conversations are often far shorter than people expect. Brevity is not shallowness. When it is born from genuine clarity, it is the most direct expression of mastery. The question of how to simplify complex ideas without distorting them is one that many experts struggle with particularly. When you have spent years developing deep knowledge in a field, that knowledge becomes the lens through which you see everything. The complexity feels real because it is real, and there is a fear that in simplifying, you will be somehow dishonest, that you will strip away the nuances that you know matter and present a version of reality that is easier to consume but less accurate. This fear, while understandable, often leads to over-explanation that serves the expert's comfort rather than the audience's understanding. The resolution to this tension is the concept of layered communication. Not everything needs to be said at once. A great communicator establishes the core idea clearly and simply, building genuine understanding at that foundational level, before adding the layers of nuance, qualification, and context that make the picture more complete. This is a radically different approach from the expert's instinct to front-load all the complexity, to prove comprehensiveness before allowing comprehension. By establishing the foundation first, you create a scaffold on which subsequent complexity can be organized and understood. By front-loading complexity, you overwhelm before connection can form. Language choices matter enormously in all of this. Not because there is a vocabulary more intelligent than another, but because different choices of language serve different communicative goals. Technical jargon is useful within a community of shared knowledge because it allows for efficient, precise communication among people who share its meanings. But it becomes a barrier, and often an unconscious display of status, when used with an audience that does not share those meanings. The most powerful communicators are fluid across registers. They can speak with depth and technical precision when the audience calls for it, and they can translate that same content into language that a non-specialist can follow without feeling condescended to. This fluency is not about dumbing down. It is about genuine intelligence, the intelligence of understanding your audience and serving their comprehension. Active structuring is another key element of clear communication that is often underused. Human minds are meaning-seeking machines. We process information not as a stream of disconnected facts, but as a structured narrative with a beginning, a middle, and an end, or as a hierarchy with main points and supporting evidence, or as a sequence with steps and outcomes. When a communicator provides that structure explicitly, they are doing work that would otherwise have to happen in the listener's mind, often imperfectly. Signposting, phrases like, "The main point here is," or "There are 3 things to understand about this," or "What this means for you is," acts as a kind of guide that keeps the audience on the same path as the speaker, reducing cognitive load and dramatically increasing comprehension and retention. Purpose is the engine beneath all of this. Because clarity alone, without a clear sense of why the communication matters, is cold and functional. It informs but does not inspire. The leaders whose words travel farthest have learned to connect the what of their message to the why, to the larger significance, the human stakes, the deeper values that give even a logistical communication a sense of meaning. This does not require sentimentality. It requires a genuine understanding of what is at stake and the willingness to name it honestly, directly, without inflation or embellishment. When people understand not just what you are asking of them, but why it genuinely matters, the quality of their engagement changes. They are not just executing instructions. They are participating in something that makes sense to them. Marcus had the kind of mind that made other professionals slightly uncomfortable. At 34, he had completed 2 master's degrees, published research in a peer-reviewed journal in his field, and developed a methodology for supply chain optimization that his organization had quietly adopted without fully crediting him. He knew more about the systems he worked with than almost anyone in his industry. He could see problems developing 3 quarters ahead of everyone else. He solved them before most of his colleagues even recognized they existed. And yet, 4 years into his tenure at his organization, Marcus had not been promoted. He had not been asked to lead any of the major initiatives he had helped design behind the scenes. His name did not appear in the conversations about future leadership. When he attended meetings, he either stayed silent, overwhelmed by the sense that explaining his thinking would take far too long, or he spoke in such dense, technical language that most of his colleagues nodded politely without understanding what he had said. In one-on-one conversations, he was intense and information-heavy, covering too much too fast, leaving people feeling exhausted rather than enlightened. What made this particularly painful was that Marcus was aware of it. He knew, on some level, that something was not working in his communication. He had read books on presentation skills and tried to apply their advice, but the scripts felt unnatural and the improvement was minimal. He had asked for feedback once from a well-meaning manager who had told him to be more concise, but conciseness felt like a betrayal of the complexity he genuinely saw. How do you be concise about something that is actually intricate? How do you compress genuine depth without losing what makes it valuable? The deeper problem, and this is one Marcus would not recognize for several more years, was not a technical problem at all. It was a relational one. Marcus had, without ever consciously deciding to, oriented his communication almost entirely around his own experience of the world he was describing. He communicated the complexity because he experienced the complexity. He used technical language because that was the language in which he thought. He went long because the long version was the version that felt honest to him. His communication was, essentially, a window into his own mind, accurate, detailed, and largely inaccessible to anyone who did not already share his reference points. What he had never fully made was the shift from communicating for himself to communicating for others. He had never asked the question that changes everything: what does this specific person, in this specific moment, actually need to understand? Not what do I know about this topic? Not what would a thorough treatment of this subject include? But what is the one thing that would genuinely move this conversation forward for the person I am speaking with right now? In the absence of that question, Marcus's considerable intelligence became a barrier rather than a bridge. His knowledge impressed, but did not connect. His analysis informed, but did not inspire. People respected his intellect from a distance, but did not feel aligned with his direction because he had never fully given them a direction to align with. He described territory with extraordinary precision, but never handed anyone a map. There was a project meeting. About 2 years into this pattern, that became a kind of quiet turning point. Not because it went well, but because it went badly enough that Marcus could no longer explain it away. The meeting was to present the findings of an 18-month analysis he had led on restructuring the organization's vendor relationships. His analysis was, by any objective measure, exceptional. The data was comprehensive. The conclusions were sound. The financial case was clear. He had prepared a 40-slide presentation that walked through the methodology, the data sources, the assumptions, the analysis, and the recommendations in careful detail. He had anticipated counterarguments and included responses to them in the appendix. He had been thorough in a way that represented genuine professional pride. But 45 minutes into the presentation, the executive team was visibly disengaged. The CFO had asked a clarifying question in the 15th minute that Marcus had answered, accurately, but at length, and never fully recovered the room's attention afterward. The CEO had asked, about 30 minutes in, "So what are we actually deciding here?" And Marcus had said, "I was about to get to that," which was not reassuring to a group of people who had been following the data for half an hour. The recommendations were sound. Several of them were eventually implemented, but they were not implemented because Marcus had moved the room that day. They were implemented later, after someone else. Someone who had listened to Marcus's analysis and then distilled it into 4 crisp sentences. Had the 5-minute conversation with the right people that Marcus's 45-minute presentation had failed to produce. What Marcus encountered over the following months, as he sat with this failure, was a kind of grief that many highly competent professionals experience. The grief was not about the outcome, exactly. It was about the recognition that the thing he valued most, his depth of understanding, his rigorous analysis, his intellectual precision, was the very thing that was preventing him from being useful in the ways he most wanted to be useful. He had believed that if he was thorough enough, people would follow. That if his logic was airtight, people would trust him. That if he demonstrated mastery, people would give him the platform to exercise it. But none of those things had happened, not because people were shallow, not because they did not care about rigor, but because knowledge that cannot be communicated effectively cannot be acted upon. And acting upon things, moving organizations, shifting decisions, creating change, is what leadership is actually for. The beginning of Marcus's transformation was not a communication course. It was a conversation. A mentor, a woman who had led large teams for over 2 decades, asked him a single question after he had described his frustration. She said, "When you walk into a meeting, what are you trying to give people?" And Marcus, after a long pause, said, "The full picture." And she said, "And what if the full picture, right now, is not what they need? What if what they need is a single clear direction to move in?" That question restructured something fundamental in Marcus's understanding of his role. He had been communicating as a researcher. His goal was accuracy, comprehensiveness, completeness. But his actual role was that of a leader. And a leader's goal is clarity of direction and mobilization of people. These require different things. And the shift from one to the other, for Marcus, was the beginning of learning to actually communicate. He did not immediately become a compelling speaker. That was not the point, and that was not what happened. What happened was slower and more significant. He began to prepare differently. Before every communication, every meeting, every memo, every conversation, he asked himself what the single most important thing was that he needed the other person to understand. He forced himself to say that one thing first. He practiced sitting with the discomfort of not saying everything he knew. He learned to treat the long version of his thinking as the raw material and the communication as the refinement. He started watching how other people who had influence in the room, structured what they said, and he began to see, slowly, how the distance between a thought and its effect on another person was not a measure of the thought's quality. It was a measure of the communicator's skill. In the crowded, noisy world of modern leadership, listening has become a radical act. Most of what passes for listening in professional settings is actually a kind of polite waiting, maintaining eye contact and nodding while your internal monologue runs at full speed. Planning your response, formulating your counterargument, calculating how long you need to wait before it is acceptable to speak. This is not listening. It is a performance of listening. And the people on the other side of it, the people you are supposedly hearing, almost always know the difference, even if they cannot name it. Something feels hollow. Something feels slightly transactional. And even if the words exchanged were entirely professional, the relationship does not deepen in the way it might have. Real listening, the kind that great communicators and great leaders practice, is fundamentally different in its quality and in what it produces. It begins with presence. Not the performance of presence, but the actual relinquishment of internal monologue, long enough to genuinely receive what another person is communicating. This is harder than it sounds, and it requires a kind of discipline that most people never consciously cultivate. Our minds are extraordinarily active. They do not naturally settle into receptive silence. They interpret, evaluate, compare, and respond in near real time. And the default mode of most minds in a conversation is to process the incoming signal just enough to generate the outgoing one. To truly listen, you have to choose to delay that process, to hold your response in abeyance, to extend the quality of your attention to the words, the tone, the pauses, the things that are not being said, and what becomes possible in that space. The space created by genuine listening is a level of understanding that reactive conversation cannot produce. You begin to hear not just the content, but the concern beneath it. Not just the question, but the uncertainty that generated it. Not just the report, but the emotion that the speaker is managing while they deliver it. And that deeper hearing is often where the most important information lies. There is a particularly important dimension of listening that is relevant in leadership specifically, which is listening to what is not said. In most organizations, the official channels of communication carry a fraction of the actual information that is flowing through the system. People tell leaders what they think leaders want to hear. They soften bad news. They omit the things that feel too risky to say directly. They package their concerns in the language of positivity and possibility because they have learned, consciously or not, that honesty sometimes has professional consequences. And because of this filtering, leaders who rely only on direct communication for their understanding of reality are systematically uninformed in ways they often do not realize. The leaders who see clearly are those who have created conditions where the unsaid can be said, where people feel safe enough to bring real problems rather than polished problems, where admitting uncertainty or delivering bad news is not career-limiting, but actually welcomed as a form of organizational health. And these conditions cannot be created by policy or by rhetoric. They are created by the accumulated experience of how people are treated when they say hard things, by whether the leader who asked for honesty actually responded to honesty with openness and curiosity, or with defensiveness and punitive energy. This is where listening becomes a leadership behavior with structural consequences. When you listen to people, genuinely, patiently, with evident care and without rushing to fix or contradict, you are not just gathering information. You are communicating something profound about the nature of your relationship with them. You are saying, in effect, your perspective is important. Your experience is real. You are worth my full attention. And that communication, even though it involves no words from you at all, is one of the most powerful things a leader can do for the quality of trust and openness in a relationship. There are specific practices that effective listeners develop over time. One is the discipline of reflective listening, summarizing back what you have heard before responding. Not parroting, not a mechanical repetition of the other person's words, but a genuine attempt to capture the essence of what they communicated and reflect it back to them for confirmation. So if I'm understanding correctly, the concern isn't really about the timeline. It's more about whether the team has the resources to meet it. Is that right? This does three things simultaneously. It ensures you have actually understood before you respond. It communicates to the other person that you were paying close enough attention to capture their meaning, and it creates a moment of alignment, a shared understanding of what is actually being discussed, that makes everything that follows far more productive. Another practice is what might be called generous interpretation. When someone says something ambiguous or unclear, the default tendency in most people is to interpret it in the most problematic or least flattering way, to assume the worst about their motives, their attitude, or their competence. Generous interpretation inverts this. It assumes the most reasonable, most charitable explanation for what was said, and it responds to that interpretation. I think you might be saying, rather than, what I heard was. It treats the other person as someone with good intentions trying to communicate something real, even if they have not communicated it particularly well. And this quality, this grace in interpretation, creates safety for people to say imperfect things and still be understood. Perhaps the most transformative listening practice is the practice of curiosity. True curiosity, not the performance of interest, but the genuine desire to understand someone else's experience, thinking, and perspective, is extraordinarily rare in conversations of any kind and almost vanishingly rare in professional settings. We are all so busy communicating our own views that the question we almost never ask and mean is, tell me how you see this. Tell me what I might be missing. Tell me what this is like from where you stand. The leaders who cultivate genuine curiosity in their conversations find that they receive a quality of information and perspective that transforms their decision-making. They find that people open in their presence in ways they do not open elsewhere. They find that their understanding of the systems they are leading becomes multidimensional rather than flat. And they find that the very act of being curious, of making people feel genuinely wondered about, is itself a form of influence. Because when someone feels truly seen and heard by a leader, Their commitment to that leader deepens in ways that no speech, however inspiring, can generate. There is also a more direct and practical benefit to listening that is worth naming. Listening is how you understand the landscape of the people you need to persuade. When you know what matters to someone, what concerns them, what they fear losing, what they hope to gain, you can address those specific things in your communication rather than speaking past them. The most common reason persuasion fails is not that the argument was weak, but that it was pointed at the wrong thing. The speaker was making the case for why the decision was right from their own perspective, rather than addressing the actual reasons. The other person might be reluctant. Listening bridges that gap. It gives you the intelligence you need to communicate with genuine relevance, to speak directly to what actually matters to the person in front of you. Of all the dimensions of leadership communication, emotional control is perhaps the most misunderstood. There is a common but damaging belief that emotional control means emotional suppression, that the disciplined communicator is the one who has successfully scrubbed all visible emotion from their expression and delivery, who speaks in a flat, measured tone regardless of what they feel, who shows nothing that could be interpreted as human reactivity. This model of emotional stoicism is not only psychologically unhealthy, but also communicatively counterproductive. The absence of visible emotion does not read as professionalism. It reads as coldness, disengagement, or inauthenticity, and none of those qualities build trust. Real emotional control in communication is not about feeling nothing. It is about the capacity to feel a great deal and choose how you express it. It is the difference between being moved and being swept away, between having an emotional response and being fully controlled by it, between acknowledging what is genuinely difficult and collapsing under its weight in front of the people who need you to remain capable. This distinction matters enormously in leadership because people take emotional cues from the leaders around them. This is not metaphorical, it is neurological. Human beings have remarkable systems for reading and mirroring the emotional states of others, particularly those in positions of authority. When a leader is calm, the room becomes calmer. When a leader is anxious, even if they have said nothing explicitly anxious, the room becomes more anxious. When a leader is steady under pressure, the people around them draw steadiness from that presence. When a leader fractures, even slightly, the stability of the entire group shifts. This is why the ability to remain emotionally regulated in the face of uncertainty, conflict, and pressure is not just a personal virtue, it is a leadership function. It is one of the most important things you can do for the people you lead. Because your calmness is not just your calmness. In the moments when things are difficult, or unclear or frightening, your calmness becomes theirs. Your steadiness gives them the bandwidth to think, to respond productively, to access their own capabilities rather than just responding from fear. There is a particular challenge that most leaders face at some point, which is the moment when they receive news, feedback, or pushback that triggers a strong internal reaction, frustration, defensiveness, fear, anger, in the context of a conversation that requires them to remain effective and clear. This is the crucible of emotional regulation, because the impulse in those moments is powerful. The feeling is real, and the opportunity to express it forcefully is right there. What separates communicators who build lasting credibility from those who erode? It is what happens in that gap between stimulus and response. The gap exists It always exists, even when it does not feel like it. The feeling of instantaneous reaction, the sense that the defensive comeback or the frustrated outburst just happened, beyond your control, is not accurate. Between every stimulus and every response there is a space, however brief, and in that space is where choice lives. The cultivation of emotional regulation is, in part, the practice of widening that space, of developing enough awareness of your own emotional states that you can recognize them before they express themselves, rather than only after. This is not a skill that can be acquired by willpower alone. It is a skill that is developed through practice, through reflection, through the honest examination of your own patterns of reactivity, and often through external support, whether that is mentorship, coaching, or a genuine feedback relationship with someone who will tell you things you need to hear about your own communication. There are practical techniques that help in specific moments. One is the simple, under-used art of pausing before responding. When something lands that stirs your reactive mind, the instinct is to respond immediately. To fill the pause with your reply before the feeling can build to something unwieldy. But the pause itself is often the most communicatively powerful thing you can do. It signals that you are taking what was said seriously. It gives you a moment to choose your response, consciously rather than reactively. And it communicates, without a word, a quality of deliberateness that people interpret as confidence and gravitas. Another technique is what might be called the emotional translator, the practice of acknowledging internally what you are feeling and then identifying what it is actually telling you, rather than just expressing it. If you are feeling defensive in response to someone's pushback, what is the defensiveness about? Is it that you believe the criticism is unfair? Is it that you are uncertain about your own position, and the challenge is exposing that uncertainty? Is it that the delivery was unkind, in a way that feels like a violation of the respect you need to function effectively? Each of these has a different appropriate response. But if you short-circuit the translation process and simply express the defensiveness raw, the response is rarely appropriate for any of them. The practice of translating before expressing does not make you less authentic. It makes you more precise in your authenticity, which is different from suppression and far more effective. Receiving criticism is a specific communication context that deserves particular attention, because how a leader responds to criticism, whether from a team member, a peer, or a superior, is one of the most watched and most revealing moments in their communication. A leader who responds to criticism with grace, openness, and genuine reflection communicates something profound about their own security and their authentic commitment to growth. A leader who responds to criticism with defensiveness, deflection, or subtle aggression communicates something equally powerful and equally lasting in the opposite direction. This does not mean accepting all criticism as valid. Some criticism is poorly founded, and the ability to engage with it honestly while calmly explaining your reasoning is itself a mark of communicative maturity. But even the pushing back on poorly founded criticism should happen from a place of security rather than threat. The message should be, "I have thought carefully about what you have said. I do not find it accurate for these specific reasons, and I respect you enough to tell you that honestly rather than pretending I agree when I do not." That is very different from a reactive dismissal, and it is very different from the kind of anxious capitulation that is sometimes mistaken for openness. The emotional dimension of communication under pressure extends to how leaders communicate bad news. This is one of the most challenging communication tasks in leadership because the natural impulses that arise when delivering bad news are almost all counterproductive. The impulse to soften the news beyond recognition, leaving people more confused than prepared. The impulse to rush through it quickly so the discomfort resolves faster. The impulse to focus on the silver lining before the difficult reality has been fully received. The impulse to distance oneself from the decision by hiding behind process, policy, or the decisions of others. None of these serve the people who need to receive the news. What serves them is a quality of presence and care that communicates. This is hard. I know it is hard. I am not going to pretend it is not hard, and I am here with you in it. The emotional honesty of that communication. The leader who can deliver a difficult message with both directness and genuine human warmth, who does not collapse into apologetics or retreat into cold formality, is one of the most profound expressions of leadership that exists. It requires real courage, and it leaves a mark on people's trust that lasts far longer than the difficulty of the news itself. Human beings have been telling each other stories for as long as language has existed. Long before there were books, or schools, or formal systems for passing down knowledge, there were stories, told around fires, across generations, through the images of cave walls. The persistence of this instinct across every culture and every era is not coincidental. It reflects something fundamental about how human minds are structured and how they process the world. We are not, at our core, information processing systems in the way computers are. We are meaning-making systems. And the primary way that human beings make meaning, the way we encode experience into memory, the way we understand cause and effect, the way we connect facts to feelings and feelings to action, is through narrative. Stories are not a supplement to human cognition. They are, in a very real sense, the native language of human cognition. And this means that for any communicator who wants their message to be not just heard but remembered, not just understood but acted upon, story is not optional. It is essential. This is not intuitive to many leaders, particularly those who come from technical or analytical backgrounds. The professional culture of most organizations values data, frameworks, and logical argument. Stories can feel informal, imprecise, not quite serious enough for the weight of the communication required, but the research on memory and persuasion tells a different story. Studies in cognitive science have consistently shown that narrative information is encoded into memory far more effectively than factual or statistical information presented in isolation. A statistic is retained when it is embedded in a story. A principle is understood deeply when it is illustrated through a specific human experience. An abstract value becomes real when it is told through the example of someone who lived it. The reason for this is rooted in how the brain processes different kinds of information. When you present someone with data and analysis, the parts of their brain associated with language processing activate and work to decode the information. When you tell them a story with a character, a challenge, a progression, a resolution, something far more extensive happens. Multiple brain systems activate simultaneously: the sensory systems, the emotional systems, the regions associated with prediction and planning. The person listening to your story does not just receive information, they experience it in a partial and neurological sense. They place themselves in the narrative. They feel the tension anticipate the resolution, draw personal meaning from the arc. And because this multi-system activation is so much richer than simple language decoding, the memory formed is correspondingly richer and more durable. What this means practically for leaders is significant. The data you present in your next quarterly review will be forgotten by most people within a few weeks. The story you tell about a customer whose problem your team solved, a specific person, a specific challenge, a specific moment where your work made a genuine difference, will still be retold months later, carrying the values and the significance you intended to communicate. The leadership principle you articulate in abstract terms will be nodded at and promptly filed somewhere inaccessible. The story of the moment when you had to choose between the expedient path and the right one, and chose the right one, with real personal cost, will become a reference point in your team's shared understanding of who you are and what you stand for. Stories are particularly powerful for communicating values because they demonstrate rather than declare. When a leader says, "We value integrity," it is an assertion, and assertions can be doubted. When a leader tells a story in which integrity was tested, in which there was a real cost to choosing it, that same value is demonstrated. The audience does not merely hear that integrity matters to this person. They see it operating under conditions of actual pressure, and that seeing produces a very different quality of belief. There is a structure to effective storytelling that is worth understanding and internalizing. The most powerful stories are not complicated. They have a person, a specific, human, relatable person, not a demographic or a composite. They have a situation, a particular context, with real stakes and real constraints. They have a challenge, something that must be navigated, a problem that must be solved, a choice that must be made. They have action, what the person actually did, including the doubts, the complications, the non-linear reality of it. And they have meaning, the larger significance, the lesson, the principle that the story makes real. This structure works because it mirrors the way human experience actually unfolds. It feels familiar. It invites the listener in. And when the meaning emerges at the end, not as a lecture, but as a discovery made possible by the story, it lands with a weight and authenticity that no statement of principle could achieve. There is an important distinction between authentic storytelling and the performance of storytelling. The techniques of narrative structure are genuinely useful, but they are only a framework. What brings a story to life is the truth in it, the specific, particular, human details that could only come from someone who was actually there, the detail that has no particular strategic purpose, but is simply true, the moment of doubt that is admitted honestly rather than elided, the ending that is not perfectly resolved, but honestly complex. These qualities, specificity, honesty, complexity, are what separate a story that moves people from a story that merely impresses them. And the difference between those two outcomes is, ultimately, the difference between communication that changes things and communication that simply passes through. Leaders sometimes worry that personal stories are too self-focused or too exposed or not appropriate for professional contexts. But the quality of vulnerability in storytelling, the willingness to share a moment of genuine struggle, genuine uncertainty, or genuine failure, is not a liability. It is, handled with appropriate judgment and purpose, one of the most powerful trust-building tools available. Not because people admire weakness, but because they recognize in your humanness a reflection of their own. When you tell a story about a time when you got it wrong, or when you were afraid, or when you did not know what to do, and then tell what you learned or how you found your way, you are not diminishing your authority. You are doing something that charts a more lasting and valuable kind of credibility. You are making yourself real. Persuasion through story works not because it bypasses rationality, but because it completes it. Rational argument tells people what to think. Story lets them feel why it matters. And the combination of understanding and feeling is what produces the kind of commitment that translates into sustained action. The most effective communicators do not choose between logic and story. They use story to give logic its emotional ground, and they use logic to give story its precision. Used together, these create a completeness of communication, a message that is understood, felt, and remembered, that either alone could not achieve. Before a single word leaves your mouth, a communication has already begun. This is not a metaphor, it is a measurable reality. The body is a communicative instrument that is continuously transmitting signals about your emotional state, your confidence level, your degree of engagement, and your relationship to the people in front of you. These signals are processed by the nervous systems of others with extraordinary speed and sophistication, often below the level of conscious awareness. People form assessments of your credibility, your warmth, your authority, and your authenticity based on what they read in your physical presence before they have had the opportunity to evaluate anything you have said. This fact about human communication creates both a challenge and an opportunity for leaders. The challenge is that you cannot control it through technique alone. You can learn to stand up straight, to make more eye contact, to slow down your gestures. And all of these things are useful at some level, but the deeper reality is that the body does not lie very convincingly for very long. If your physical presence communicates one thing and your internal experience is another, that dissonance will eventually show. People who study nonverbal communication consistently note that when verbal and nonverbal messages conflict, people believe the nonverbal, always, almost without exception, because we have evolved to trust the body's honest signals over the composed signals of language. This creates a very interesting and important implication for presence. The most powerful investment in your nonverbal communication is not the cultivation of better techniques, though techniques have their place, but the cultivation of actual equanimity. The real foundation of commanding physical presence is internal groundedness. The leader, whose body language communicates ease and authority, is very often the leader who has done enough work. Through experience, through reflection, through genuine development, to feel genuinely centered even under pressure. The posture of confidence is most sustainably achieved by working toward actual confidence, rather than mimicking its physical expression. That said, it is also true that the relationship between physical state and mental state runs in both directions. Intentional changes to how you hold your body can influence how you feel. Standing fully upright rather than slightly hunched, breathing more slowly and deeply, taking up space rather than contracting, making deliberate and steady eye contact. Each of these physical adjustments creates a measurable shift in the nervous system. They signal safety and capacity to your own brain as well as to others. They are not sufficient, but they are useful, and they are worth developing as conscious practices. Presence is perhaps the most important and least teachable dimension of nonverbal communication. It is the quality of full, Genuine attention. The sense that is communicated to another person that they have, in this moment, the whole of your being available to them. People can tell when they have your presence, and they can tell, with remarkable accuracy and speed, when they only have your performance. The difference is experienced not as a thought, but as a feeling. It is the difference between a conversation that feels alive and one that feels like a transaction, between being with someone and being attended by them. Developing genuine presence requires the same kind of internal work that emotional regulation requires. It requires the capacity to quiet the internal noise, the planning, the evaluating, the self-monitoring, long enough to be truly available to the moment and the person in it. This is a practice, not a state you achieve once and maintain automatically. Most communicators, even excellent ones, find themselves partially absent in conversations, present enough to function, but not present enough to fully connect. The practice of genuine presence is the practice of noticing when you have slipped into partial availability and choosing to return. Eye contact deserves particular attention because it is, in most cultures, the primary signal of presence and engagement. Too little eye contact reads as evasiveness, low confidence, or lack of interest. Too much, held too rigidly without natural variation, becomes invasive or performative. Effective eye contact is relational. It follows the natural rhythms of connection, providing enough sustained contact to communicate genuine engagement while allowing the natural breaks that make it feel human rather than intense. In groups, distributing eye contact broadly and genuinely, not in a mechanical rotation, but in an authentic way that reflects actual attention, communicates inclusivity and genuine engagement with the whole room, rather than selective focus on the people you find easiest to look at. Voice is a non-verbal channel that is often underdeveloped in leaders who think primarily in terms of verbal content. The same words delivered in different tones, at different speeds, with different patterns of emphasis, communicate fundamentally different messages. A voice that is too fast signals anxiety. A voice that is too flat signals indifference. A voice that rises at the end of declarative sentences signals uncertainty about one's own assertions. A phenomenon sometimes called upspeak that systematically undermines the credibility of everything the speaker is saying, however substantive. A voice that is genuinely grounded, that moves at a pace allowing for comprehension, that has natural variation in emphasis reflecting genuine engagement, that conveys the speaker's relationship to what is being said, is one of the most powerful communicative instruments available. Pausing, as a vocal practice, is transformative. Strategic pauses before important points allow the audience to shift attention and prepare to receive what is coming. Pauses after important points give the audience time to absorb before the next point arrives. Pauses when a difficult question is asked communicate the kind of considered deliberateness that breeds confidence in a leader's responses. Most people use too few pauses, and they use them in the wrong places. Rushing through to fill the silence, treating silence as a problem rather than a resource. The communicator, who becomes genuinely comfortable in silence, who can let a pause expand without anxiety, gains a quality of authority that is difficult to achieve by any other means. Physical positioning and movement in a space communicate dynamics of power, engagement, and relationship in ways that most leaders are underaware of. Movement toward people communicates interest and connection. Movement away communicates formality or authority. Standing still in one place, for an extended period of time communicates groundedness. The way a leader moves in the room, during a presentation or a meeting shapes the emotional dynamics of that room significantly, and the leaders who are conscious of this dimension have an additional tool for managing the quality of the experience they create for others. Trust is built in moments that seem small. This is perhaps the most important thing to understand about trust as it relates to communication. We tend to think about trust in terms of the large demonstrations, the difficult decision made with integrity, the significant commitment that was honored under pressure, the moment of crisis navigated with grace. And those moments matter. They matter enormously, but they are not actually where most trust is built or destroyed. Trust is built and destroyed in the accumulation of ordinary moments. The commitment made casually in a meeting and then quietly forgotten. The word of appreciation given in front of the team, and whether it feels genuine or performed. The way someone is treated when they are not in the room. The gap between what the leader says in the all-hands meeting and what actually happens in the weekly one-on-one. Consistency is the engine of trust. And consistency in communication is about far more than saying the same things repeatedly. It is about the alignment, the wholeness, between what you say, what you do, and what you are actually like. People are exquisite detectors of incongruence. When the words do not match the behavior, when the stated values do not show up in the actual decisions, when the warmth of the public communication is contradicted by the coldness of the private one, people register the gap, even when they cannot articulate what feels off. And that registration is how trust erodes, not usually in a single dramatic betrayal, but in the slow accumulation of small incongruences that leave people feeling, without necessarily being able to say why, that they cannot quite rely on what this person says. The flip side is equally true. Small acts of consistency, the steady fulfillment of small commitments, the alignment of private and public behavior, the quality of attention given to people across all contexts, and not just the visible ones, build trust with a durability that is almost impossible to dislodge. People who have experienced consistent integrity from a leader carry that experience forward. They extend credit during uncertainty. They give benefit of the doubt when things go wrong. They interpret ambiguous signals generously because the accumulated evidence of integrity is the dominant pattern. And this reservoir of trust is perhaps the most valuable asset a leader can build, because it is both the protective cushion that absorbs the inevitable failures and the amplifier that multiplies the impact of the successes. One dimension of communicative consistency that deserves specific attention is the language of commitment. Leaders make commitments constantly, in formal settings and informal ones, in large declarations and small asides. I look into that. Let's circle back on this next week. I'll make sure you hear about this before it's final. Each of these is a small promise. And the keeping or breaking of small promises is one of the most reliable indicators of a leader's actual relationship to their word, and therefore one of the most powerful builders or destroyers of trust. The most effective leaders develop a very deliberate relationship with what they commit to. They commit less, but they commit fully. They would rather say, "I may not be able to get to that today, but I will confirm by Thursday," than the easier, "I'll get to that today," followed by silence. This kind of precision, this care with the language of commitment, is not coldness or excessive formality. It is respect. It is the communication of someone who takes their word seriously enough to only give it when they can honor it. And people feel this. The leader who consistently delivers on their commitments, even the small ones, even the ones that require inconvenient effort to fulfill, creates an expectation of reliability that eventually becomes a foundational assumption. You can count on this person. What they say will happen will happen. Trust is also built through honesty in the face of pressure to be less than honest. This includes the pressure to overpromise in order to motivate, the pressure to present a rosier picture than reality supports, the pressure to avoid delivering feedback that might be unwelcome, the pressure to dodge difficult questions with diplomatic non-answers. Each of these pressures is real, and in most professional contexts, succumbing to them is the path of least resistance. The short-term consequences of honesty, discomfort, disappointment, difficult conversation, are immediate and concrete. The long-term consequences of habitual strategic vagueness, eroded credibility, diminished trust, an organization that cannot have honest conversations, are diffuse and delayed. This is why the discipline of honest communication requires more than good intentions. It requires a genuine commitment to the long view, a willingness to absorb short-term discomfort in service of the relationship and the organization that exist, not just now but through time. There is a specific form of communicative honesty that is particularly powerful and particularly rare in leadership, which is the acknowledgement of uncertainty. Most leaders feel strong pressure to project certainty, to have the answers, to communicate direction with confidence, to avoid the appearance of doubt. This pressure is understandable. People look to leaders for direction, and direction expressed with visible uncertainty can feel less like direction and more like question. But the effort to always appear certain, when genuine uncertainty exists, creates a very specific and corrosive form of communication problem. It generates a culture in which uncertainty must be hidden, in which people at all levels are performing more confidence than they feel, in which real problems are acknowledged too late, because acknowledging them earlier would have meant acknowledging that they were not fully understood. The leader who has the security and the skill to say, "I don't know yet, and here is how we will find out," who can communicate direction and process without manufacturing false certainty about outcomes, creates a fundamentally different and healthier organizational culture, one in which honesty about the limits of current knowledge is not a vulnerability but a practice, in which people trust that what they are being told is what is actually known, rather than having to apply a credibility discount to everything, because they have learned that the official version is always optimistic. This kind of communicative courage, the courage to be honest about uncertainty, is one of the most profoundly trust-building things a leader can do, precisely because it is so uncommon. The relationship between what a leader communicates about others and how they are trusted is also worth noting. How leaders speak about people who are not in the room is observed carefully and remembered vividly by those who are. A leader who speaks about absent colleagues with respect, care, and fairness communicates something to everyone in that conversation about how they themselves will be spoken about when they are not present. A leader who uses private conversations as an opportunity to vent, diminish, or be disloyal about others creates a very different kind of environment, one of subtle threat, where trust is rationed because it is understood to be conditional. The alignment of how you speak about people when it is costly to be fair, with how you speak about people when it is easy, is one of the most revealing measures of communicative character. 15 years after the meeting that had revealed how little his communication skills served his capabilities, Marcus sat at the head of a small conference table and did something he could not have imagined in his earlier years. He asked the room a question, and then he said nothing and let the silence grow. The project his team was working on had just encountered a significant obstacle. A key vendor relationship had fallen through in the final stages of negotiation. The timeline was compromised. Some of the team members around the table were clearly anxious. A few were watching Marcus to read the temperature of the moment. In his earlier years, he would have moved immediately to fill that silence with analysis. He would have presented the problem in full, offered preliminary solutions, demonstrated his command of the situation. It would have felt like leadership. It would have looked efficient. And it would have produced, as it always had, the same outcome. People who understood the problem from his perspective and agreed with his solution, but who had never quite become co-owners of either the thinking or the resolution. Instead, he sat with the silence for a long moment, and then, when the weight of it had settled fully into the room, he said simply, "Before I share my thinking, I want to understand what you are seeing. What is this situation telling each of you?" What followed was 40 minutes of conversation that he had not fully anticipated. People saw dimensions of the problem that he had not seen. They had relationships and knowledge and insights that, in his earlier mode, would never have surfaced because he would not have left the space for them to emerge. By the end of the meeting, the resolution they arrived at was better, significantly better, than the one he had walked in with. This was not a single dramatic transformation. It was the latest expression of something that had been building for more than a decade. The journey from the analyst who knew everything and communicated very little of it effectively to the leader who communicated with genuine power had been long and non-linear and sometimes discouraging. There had been courses that helped and courses that did not. There had been mentors who gave feedback he needed and others who gave only the feedback he wanted. There had been public failures and private reckonings and moments of clarity that had reorganized something important in his understanding of what communication was actually for. What had shifted most fundamentally was not technique. The techniques had come. The discipline of the single clear sentence, the practice of genuine listening, the narrative skills that allowed him to take complex data and give it human significance, the calm that he had cultivated through years of managing his own reactivity. All of those were real, and they were valuable. But beneath them was something more foundational. He had stopped communicating to prove his value and started communicating to create it. He had stopped speaking from the position of someone trying to establish expertise and started speaking from the position of someone trying to move a group of people toward a shared goal. And this shift, this fundamental reorientation of the purpose of communication from self-presentation to service, was what had changed everything. The strange and somewhat humbling thing he had come to believe was that the clearest way to build genuine authority was to stop reaching for it. That the most powerful communicators were not those who tried hardest to control the room, but those who could release the need to control it and trust in something more durable: their own preparedness. The quality of their relationships, the clarity of their thinking, and their genuine care for the people they were trying to lead. His team, in the years he had been leading in this way, had built the kind of trust with him that he had once observed from a distance in other leaders and struggled to understand the source of. They came to him with real problems rather than packaged problems. They told him when things were not working before it was too late. They worked harder for him than for leaders who paid more or promised more, because the communication between them was honest and the relationship was real. And sometimes, sitting in a moment like this one, when a room full of intelligent people were genuinely working together toward something, because the conditions for real communication existed, Marcus would feel something close to gratitude for the long, difficult journey that had brought him here. Not because the journey had been pleasant, but because nothing he had learned about leadership, about genuine influence, about the kind of trust that enables people to do their best work, could have been learned any faster or any less expensively than it had been. We end where we began, with a room, with a leader, with the space between what is known and what is communicated. That space is not a technical problem. It is a human one, and it can be bridged, not perfectly, not once and for all, but again and again, through the commitment to communicate with more intention, more clarity, more honesty, and more genuine care than before. Leadership communication is not a performance. It is not a collection of techniques assembled to impress or to manipulate, or to simulate confidence you do not feel. It is, at its best, the expression of who you actually are as a leader, your thinking, your values, your genuine concern for the people you serve, translated with skill and care into forms that others can receive, understand, and act upon. The most influential people in history were not always the smartest. They were not always the most technically capable. They were not always the ones who worked the hardest or who had the most resources. They were often, perhaps most consistently, the ones who could communicate with honesty, purpose, and confidence. Who could take the complexity of what they understood and distill it into something another person could hold? Who could listen deeply enough to understand not just what people said, but what they needed? Who could remain steady when things were difficult and human, when things were personal and clear, when things were confusing? These qualities are not gifts. They are disciplines, and they are available to anyone who is willing to do the work. Not the performative work of technique acquisition, but the deeper and more durable work of genuine development. The work of becoming clearer in your own thinking, more honest in your relationships, more genuinely present in your conversations, more comfortable in silence and more courageous in difficulty, more willing to be wrong and more committed to being real. Communication is where leadership begins. Not because leaders have all the answers, but because the absence of clear communication leaves organizations, relationships, and communities without direction, without trust, and without the shared understanding that makes collective action possible. The leader who communicates well is not just effective in meetings. They are the person who makes clarity possible when confusion is spreading, the person who makes honesty possible when it is easier to be vague, the person who makes trust possible when circumstances tempt cynicism. There is a phrase worth sitting with as you move forward. It is not a motivational slogan. It is an observation about leadership that becomes more true the more carefully you examine it. The words you choose, the way you listen, the honesty you bring to difficult conversations, the consistency between what you say and what you do. These are not supporting elements of your leadership. They are its most direct expression. People will forget your presentations. They will forget the specifics of your strategies, but they will carry with them, sometimes for their entire careers, the quality of how you made them feel when you communicated with them. Whether they felt understood or dismissed, respected or managed, trusted or handled. That is the measure that matters most, not the impressiveness of your vocabulary, not the sophistication of your framework, not the length of your speech or the power of your data, but whether, in the space of your communication, people felt genuinely met by a leader who had done the work to show up clearly, honestly, and fully present. That is the voice of leadership, and it is yours to develop.